Hey everyone, my name is Ashley Heavener and I'm doing a presentation on education policy, funding, and reform options. The first article that I did was an overview of the school finance systems in Texas. During that article, you will read that there's a two-tier system. They have foundation school programs, they recapture a lot of their funding, and then they have a target revenue, facilities funding, as well as available state aid for tax reduction. Their schools are funded through a combination of local revenue, state revenue, and federal revenue. And the aid is affected by property value increases. And when these increases happen, they can recap some of their money through the recapture program. Recaptured revenue flows back to the state. It helps to offset the state's costs of supporting foundation programs, and the high wealth districts help to create this. This is for the areas that have a higher property value and everything versus the kind of lower income areas. The higher areas help to offset things with the lower areas. For the foundation school programs, also called FSP, you've got your Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1s help support the basic accredited education programs. They have a local fund assignment, and each student usually begins the year with a basic allotment. Tier 2 provides access to funds for program enrichment, uses a guaranteed yield system, and the money comes from state aid and local revenue. For Tier 2, it helps to provide additional funds for school districts. In low wealth districts, it raises as much as the tax district will allow, and then the state aid kicks in and helps to bring them up to the minimum. So it kind of helps to fill that gap in. In the higher wealth districts, they usually don't get state aid because they meet their minimum without it. For the target revenue system was implemented back in 2006, and during that year, school property taxes were reduced by 1/3. Because of this, they also had the available state aid for tax reduction program, which also had the hold harmless. And this was a feature that helped those programs that were falling short of funding to kind of help fill in the gaps during the tax reduction. When property values started to go up in certain districts, this kind of helped to fix the process with the formulas that they use to determine the funding. There's two different types of facilities funding. You've got instructional facilities allotment and then the existing debt allotment. For the instructional facilities allotment, the IFA, it's competitive grants that make state support available either for debt service payments on qualifying bonds or lease purchase agreements for new instructional facilities. These are assistances, and it's all grant-based in order to help service a debt. For the existing debt allotment, it's essentially the school districts are granted $35 per penny, and that can help for service bonds for which the districts have already levied. There's no application for these funds. They're automatically available in property wealth areas that are less than $350,000 per ADA. And then this program has remained unchanged for 15 years. And then due to the property wealth increases, very few districts actually qualify for the state support system. So this could be a possible area for reform in the state of Texas. Then I've included 2 quotes from the article. This was from a Supreme Court hearing. The Texas school finance system is constitutionally inadequate, unsuitable, and financially insufficient. This was the initial ruling from one of the court hearings. And then they came back with a rebuttal and said, despite the imperfections of the current school funding regimen, it meets minimum constitutional requirements. And so that ruling was revoked. The next article that we did was the School Finance and Property Taxes by Youngman. During that article, she goes over different things with that affected 5 different states. You've got, for California specifically, it's the Proposition 13 effects. She went over like income tax versus property tax, centralized funding, and then decreased performance. And then the states that she involved in her article were California, New Hampshire, Michigan, Kentucky, and Vermont. For California specifically, the Proposition 13 was implemented in 1978. The state determines the distribution of funds. This was a shift from local to state, and during that shift, 1/3 of the property tax revenue was taken away from grades K through 12. And during that time, the national rank for schools in California went from 11th down to 34th. Schools are financed in California. Funding is determined through the revenue limit formula. Property tax assessments and collections is a local responsibility. And then the private voluntary non-tax contributions in 2011 were $547 million. They kind of look at it as the wealthy can fill in the gaps, and they kind of expect them to. The next slide is going to be just kind of a graph of the differences from that 2005 to 2006 drop from 2009 to 2010. And it's the budgeting differences from when they had to start cutting things and put in a centralized financing program. In California, they kind of expected homeowners would be willing to pay higher property taxes if they were convinced this led to higher quality schools. In New Hampshire, it's the only state in the nation without a statewide sales tax or general income tax. Property taxes were ruled unconstitutional to use for funding. The state imposed a tax on real property at a rate of 66%. And locally administered tax has become a state levy for funding in New Hampshire. For Michigan, they have a centralized system. This has caused kind of some issues with their economic difficulties. Kentucky's educational system was deemed completely unconstitutional, and they had to go under a complete reform. Vermont had the Act 60, which was kind of a sharing pool, as more of a rob Peter, give to Paul kind of method. Take from the rich, give to the poor. Limitations on their budgets led to increase in private fundraising to fill in the gaps. And then the last article that we had was the suburban school districts and demographic changes, the technical, normative, and political dimensions of response. This was by Holmes and several other people. The main things that was touched on in this article was the 3 different types of suburbs. You've got the at-risk, the bedroom developing, and the affluent job center. The at-risks are going to be your high growing rates of poverty, low tax base due to low levels of commercial activity. Your bedroom developing are kind of your prototypical majority white, new housing, fast growth area. And then your affluent job center is going to be your high-end office space areas. Those areas are going to result in a greater tax resource and then high property values with low levels of social needs. She also goes into detail on the Cooper study, which is where educators failed to enact changes needed for the changing demographics of their schools. Superficial changes were made, but in the end caused other issues in the process. The zone of mediation was put in place to set parameters of policy, behavior, beliefs, and actions for schools and districts. This is the zone to stay within in order to prevent protests by the community or educators themselves. The zone of mediation was kind of put into place through like technical, normative, and political dynamics. And then there was also a study done in San Antonio. During that study, they had some rapid diversity changes in a short amount of time. They were having issues with some white parents were electing to send their children to private schools versus having them be mixed in with the changing demographics of their neighborhood schools. During that case study, they also implemented instructional specialists to help bring up the kind of grade level of the students. They were noticing there were some major downfalls in specific areas like math, reading, science, social studies. So they brought in specific specialists that were trained in those areas to work with those children on a day-to-day basis to try and get them up to the level that they needed to be through hands-on training. They also tried to implement some accountability matrix. Those didn't prove to be quite as beneficial. They seemed more time-consuming. Rezoning efforts were also done, but then there was also the issue of they felt that during the rezoning there was it was still kind of rezoned to like more of like the poor areas, lower socioeconomic areas in one area, and then like the higher, wealthier areas were in the other area. So there wasn't a good distribution of demographics of students when they tried to do rezoning. And then there was also some PTA issues as well during and so to tie things up, school reform has some great challenges ahead. There's no standardized form of reform, and there's always going to be demographic changes. There's going to be internal and external pushback. It's always going to be a balancing act between public officials. There's usually 4 aspects that the public officials are having to kind of fall between, and it's the equalization, adequacy of funding, centralization, and local autonomy. For finance reform, it's only part of the picture. Property taxation can only go so far. It shouldn't be the only focus. They need to be looking at some other avenues of funding. The quality of schools need to be improved. This is probably kind of the last thing that usually gets focused on. Maybe looking at some areas of diversity among teachers is one aspect. Racial balance between schools when rezoning efforts occur, and then having more of an additive approach to the understanding of the home culture of students within the districts they serve could be beneficial. And then I've included 2 questions on the last page. When it comes to education reform, do you think these issues should be handled on a local level or mandates handed down from the state? Which do you think would be more beneficial for the local areas? Do you think it would be better to have people from that area coming in who are more familiar with the area, the demographics of the people, and kind of the needs, making changes and observations, or having, a state mandated company come in who doesn't know the area and implementing changes from there. The other question is, should funding come from different sources or stay the way it is currently in the state of Texas? I'll be interested to see what your results are on that. And then I have a works cited page, and that's it. Thank you very much. Hey everyone, my name is Ashley Heavener, and I'm doing a presentation on education policy, funding, and reform options. The first article that I did was an overview of the school finance systems in Texas. During that article, you will read that there's a two-tier system. They have foundation school programs, they recapture a lot of their funding, and then they have a target revenue, facilities funding, as well as available state aid for tax reduction. Their schools are funded through a combination of local revenue, state revenue, and federal revenue. And the aid is affected by property value increases. And when these increases happen, they can recap some of their money through the recapture program. Recaptured revenue flows back to the state. It helps to offset the state's cost of supporting foundation programs, and the high wealth districts help to create this. This is for the areas that have a higher property value and everything versus the kind of lower income areas. The higher areas help to offset things with the lower areas. For the foundation school programs, also called FSP, you've got your Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1s help support the basic accredited education programs. They have a local fund assignment, and each student usually begins the year with a basic allotment. Tier 2 provides access to funds for program enrichment, uses a guaranteed yield system, and the money comes from state aid and local revenue. For Tier 2, it helps to provide additional funds for school districts. In low wealth districts, it raises as much as the tax district will allow, and then the state aid kicks in and helps to bring them up to the minimum. So it kind of helps to fill that gap in. In the higher wealth districts, they usually don't get state aid because they meet their minimum